Hi everybody, in this chat, I'm thrilled to talk with Joshua Jenkins, someone who I've known for over 20 years online and also offline. He's a very talented designer, developer, entrepreneur, and also design leader. And in this fun chat, we talk about everything from how he got started, all the cool things that are going on with AI, with design, and also a lot of time is spent on what it's like to be a manager, how to transition from being an individual contributor to a manager, and the many things along the way that you discover. Hope you enjoy it. Right, Josh, great to finally meet you. Despite I think we met when? Was it like 2006 when we met in person?
That sounds right. Yeah, it's been a while.
Yeah, I think it was like the University of Washington campus. I feel like I think you were
Yeah.
there and I was interning at the time, and then we kind of met. And then of course we know each other online for ages at this point. And so yeah, you've been sharing a lot of cool stuff forever, and I always feel like you wear many hats very effectively: designer, developer, and then design leader, startup, entrepreneur, and all these things. And so at some point, I think we'll touch upon all these things going forward. So I'd like to start with the question I typically always ask is, what was the first thing you remember building?
Okay. It's an interesting question, and I'll start with saying thanks for having me here. This is great to be here. First thing I remember building. Oh, you know what? Back in the AOL Instant Messenger days, which was a long time ago, and people listening to this probably have no idea what that is, but probably in like 2000, I don't know, something like that. Um, it was building. Um, Basically like animated GIFs for like you had little avatars and like you had this little like icon and it was like your aim icon. And that was like the first thing I remember making, which was like frame by frame, pixel by pixel making, and they were like 16 by 16 or 32 by 32, like tiny, right? Super constrained environment and just making these like goofy little like animated faces and stuff like that. So that was the first thing I actually remember making. And I was probably like, I don't know, 13 or something.
Wow. And do you know what tool you were using to make those?
It was, what's actually, it was before Photoshop because I couldn't afford Photoshop. Um, I don't. It might have been GIMP. I don't know. It might have been even something
Yeah.
more obscure and weird.
Yeah, those were like fun days because nowadays you're like 16 by 16, it's like in almost invisible.
You can't see
But
it.
back then,
Yeah,
like most of your screens like 640 by 480 or 800 by 600, if you're lucky, 1024 by 768. And
yeah,
16 by 16 was like a massive amount of real estate to work with.
yeah. Totally. Yeah, it's crazy how different it is.
Yeah, it's the funny thing also is just that with higher DPI screens now, all that pixel-like art, 16 by 16 things from like 20 years ago, just looks awful today,
Oh
and no
yeah,
one's
yeah,
quite figured out how to still bring that world forward again.
yeah. I mean, I think there's like two. Like, there's the people that like kind of like try to faithfully scale things up in like the grid, right, and keep the crisp lines. And then there's all this stuff now where people are like feeding it into like, AI and generative stuff, and right, and then it's like blows up a 16 by 16 thing into like a physical avatar. It's crazy. Yeah,
Yeah, and then the next complication is like, okay, you figured all that out, you got it perfectly sized. Then you need to share it somewhere, and where do you go? You go to like Twitter or Instagram or so on, and they happen to scale it and compress it in their own way. After you're like, great, I spent all this time doing this,
I know.
and now I can't do anything anymore.
Yeah, I think there's like a generation of people that work on screens that probably feel this pain all the time. Where it's like, I think a lot of us spent so much time with like pixel precision and like just getting things to like be precise, and then all of this, yeah, million screens and different networks and all this stuff, and it's just like this constant losing battle. But until they get to like, I think like maybe like another 2x on like Retina, you can still kind of tell. So we're not quite out of the woodwork where like you can just do whatever.
Yeah, like I guess like the 8K screens might be the ones that can ultimately do this for you. Because the funny thing is that Vimeo came out a long time ago, and they were all about like we're not going to compress your videos as much. We'll give you
Yeah.
really high quality videos. And so a lot of like designers and people who cared about high quality visuals end up uploading to Vimeo, and it was actually really cool. But the
Yeah.
downside was the whole network effect, and everyone just kept going to YouTube because it was YouTube. Everything was there. From like high quality animation stuff, but also like music videos and cat
Hmm.
videos, all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
And this like the market for it just seems to keep going to in a direction that doesn't really help us too much.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think yeah, there's just, mass media and it kind of dictates the forms, unfortunately.
Yep. So you started as the first thing you remember designing, and then you ultimately became, in many ways, a designer full time. Both
Yeah.
personally and as well as like professionally. So how did that transition go from like you just enjoying creating things to making the leap?
Um, it's an interesting question. I managed to get a couple of odd jobs when I was in like high school, like getting paid hourly to skin a site or something like that, right? And I think that would probably like the first kind of like dip into like professional, but it was very like, I had no training. I didn't know what that world looked like. I was just doing like stuff, right? And then I took a detour through like college and like early jobs. Was very far from this stuff, but um, I worked at HP of all places in I don't know 2000 I don't know, three, let's call it. And I had this kind of random job where basically like I went around to like different offices and I like found where people's printers were and I like put them on a map and I was like, okay, like you have this type of printer and then I put it on a map and I plot this thing all out and you do little interviews with people, how much you print, what kind of stuff you need to do, whatever. And the tools we used were like super cumbersome. And then like I made some random like HTML, PHP, like totally crappy thing, but like something that helped me do that a little bit. And then I would like spend my time like making that thing nicer. And I was like, I really like making this thing nicer. And I didn't know it at the time, but I'm effectively doing like UX design or like product design for a customer of one, which is me. And like this was not sanctioned in any way, right? This was like not like like this was not like, hey, go, we like you doing this, keep doing this. But I realized I like doing that. And then I started to just kind of like look out there and see like what other kinds of ways to like kind of apply that thing would be. Again, having no idea what the industry looks like, having no idea about anything. And eventually found my way into agencies, I guess, in Portland, Oregon. So I was working at some smaller and some larger agencies, basically doing like web work or like random creative work, right? But even that was super interesting because like I've always come at things kind of like from a weird sideways way. So I'm this kind of like I kind of got hired as kind of like the digital guy, they kind of just like sort of like jack of all trades, can just kind of do stuff, knows enough about design, knows enough about coding, can kind of bridge the gap. Like, um, I'm working with like, like legit graphic designers, right? Who are like color theory and typography and like grids and all this kind of stuff. And like, you think you understand this stuff and then you see people who like live and breathe it and you're like, oh wow, no, there's like a whole deep universe here I don't understand at all. But yeah, so I ended up at agencies like that. And, super cool to get to like kind of be around these other skill sets and kind of grow from there. And there's a bunch more hops after that, but that's kind of that's how I formally got into like design, like into agencies.
Do you think your formal education helped as you were starting to do some of this work, or is it just like can you mention, like just randomly experimenting, trying things out, and that gave you the ability to be successful?
Yeah, so I am not a formal education success story. So I dropped out of I think like four or five colleges. So I think the cool thing to do is drop out of Harvard and like I dropped out of community college. So I think that's maybe cooler. But yeah, the formal education, I got exposed to some ideas, I would say, but I didn't like learn useful web design skills in college, I would say.
Yeah, but it definitely seemed like you were passionate, interested about it, though, because even though formal education might not have been your style, you still knew that you wanted to be in this industry, and you still worked hard at getting to learning all these skills in other ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair. I think there's always been like a genuine just sort of like curiosity and interest, and I think that's what's driven. That's been the through line through everything, right? It's always been like, what's the next interesting thing? Like, what do I want to learn? That kind of stuff. So yeah, the sort of wanting to figure it out part has been very helpful.
Yeah, you can see that in so many examples of people who end up being, who just enjoy what they do. Is oftentimes just that curiosity and that drive, and often that grind itself. Sometimes, I think too many people spend way too much effort trying to optimize for like the ideal environment to build
Hmm.
something in a scalable way. I'm like, just start and just do it. It might take you hours upon hours, but getting it done and the things you learn indirectly through that probably far more valuable than coming with the perfect solution at the very beginning.
Strongly agree. Strongly co-sign. Yeah.
Yeah, and I see it more often now, because I'm not a designer, nor am I a developer. I'm a product manager, but I get to work with all these disciplines on a regular basis, and often in the back of my mind, I can see that pattern coming through all the time, and I see people like, wow, that person's, they understand what's going on, and you dig a little deeper. It's always a case where they just spent like I don't know if it's a 10,000 hours thing by Gladwell is truly a number, but it's an idea that they spent a lot of time doing something that only they saw the real value in it, but it ended up paying dividends for them eventually.
Yeah, I agree, and I think the yeah, if you can find your own path, it's going to be more successful, I think, than like taking a described path, right? Because then you're going to like, your curiosity and your motivation is going to drive you through all of that. So yeah, agree.
At some point, I also feel like not only you're a designer, but you also have a strong understanding of programming. So how did that come about?
I would definitely do not have a strong understanding of programming. I have a sort of like begrudging, like I need to program to realize things I want to do. But the degree to which I'm bad at programming, I like cannot overstate. If I'm working on something actively for like a week, I can kind of remember things. But if it goes away, like I wrote all this code a week ago that I was really proud of, and I was looking at it like yesterday, and I was like, I have no idea what this is or how it works or anything like that. Um, and constantly. So like, I just want to start there, which is like, you know, programming's hard, and I think some people take more naturally to it than others. But yeah, I think it started from. Um, it's actually funny. I think it honestly like probably started from your forums back in the day. I remember there was like I think you had like a how to make snow on an HTML page like thing
Yes.
tutorial. Yeah, yeah, right. Things like that. I just didn't know that was possible, right? And so it was a curiosity. It's kind of like, oh, cool. I didn't know you could do these kinds of things. Preceding that, even actually, I remember when I was using Netscape Navigator, and it had like an inspector panel thing, and I remember going to um, the New York Times website or something, and going to the inspector panel, and it would let you. It was very different back then. It kind of made it feel like it was like a WYSIWYG, like you were actually editing the page. And I remember going to like the page and like editing the title, and then being really scared to hit the like save button because I was like, oh my gosh, am I like defacing like the New York Times? Is it going to save? Because I don't know how anything works, right? And so anyway, like all this kind of stuff, I'm just like I had no idea how anything worked, and so I think it was just this like slow process of like picking stuff apart and eventually I would like have goals and tasks, like, oh, I want to accomplish something. But at first I was just like literally just like poking stuff. I'm like, I don't know. I didn't know any of these things existed. So long winded answer, but something like that.
I mean, that's pretty much how the world was back then as well, because I think both you and I kind of grew up together at the same stage of the internet and technology and all these things. You had like GeoCities and
Yeah,
Lycos, and I think like MySpace was just coming about, and there was no guidance, there was no like real tutorials or best practices or anything like that. There was no like O'Reilly book on like here's a definitive guide to how you build a proper web app. It's like I
totally.
think what was it, like was it WebMonkey? WebMonkey you had this like really cool like bright colors, and they were like here's how you create a list and things like that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Mm.
yeah,
I remember, like you mentioned, Netscape, right? Like, Netscape Composer was like one of the first IDEs that I ever used for like building a
yeah,
web page. It came free with your browser. Then I switched over to Front Page Express because at that time IE was having more of the cooler capabilities than what Netscape had. And yeah, you're right. We're probably dating ourselves. Like this entire audience has no clue what's
I
going
know.
on. But you'll be surprised though. Like the demographic information I get from like Spotify and so on, it's around exactly our age, which is not
Okay,
surprising in topics we talk
okay,
about. So we're basically talking to each other, and that's the
okay,
audience for it.
perfect. Yeah, I mean, if you want to go for the younger audience, I guess just AI replace all the Netscapes with TikTok, and it'll be fine.
Oh, yeah, but speaking of AI, have you dabbled into AI to kind of help your coding go further?
In terms of like a coding, the one place I found it to be helpful with coding, I don't use Copilot or anything like that. I'm like very much like an old man at this point where like I have a hard time adopting new tools. So I have my like set of things that work and it's fine. But um, the thing I found it very useful for is because I'm a weak programmer, I have a very like unknown problem where it's like I know the end state thing I'm trying to get to, and I know that there's some conceptual version of it that exists in the universe. I know like there's an algorithm or there's a formula or something. I don't know what it's called. I don't even know how to search for it. I'm not good enough at math to know what like the math to look for, whatever. And so I'll just type in like very dumb things into Chat GPT and just describe the thing, and it'll often spit out like some morsel that will give me something Googleable, right? So that I can actually find like a tutorial or something. But in terms of like, I did play around a little bit with like could I just automate myself? Could I describe the stuff I'm doing well enough for it to just spit out the stuff I'm doing? And I didn't quite get there, but that's more a limitation of myself and my prompt engineering skills than I think like the tool. I think you probably could.
Yeah, and I think that'd be interesting to see. I do like to play around with it all the time just to see like how good it is. I do find that ChatGPT, Bard, and others are really good for like it's all the training data they ultimately train against, right? I think there's just a shortage of high quality training data for animations and visualizations in general because when I ask it to like here I have a column of text, make it optimize it, like sort it or whatever, and write the
Mm-hmm.
code for it, it does a fantastic job. Both of them like copy and pastable. I just paste in, it just works. No need to worry about it. I asked it to actually figure out, create me a performance star field. effect, kind of like the
Hmm.
old Windows screensavers, right? Like,
Yep.
zooming in. There are many ways of doing that. The proper way is actually you create a fake Z, like three-dimensional area, and you adjust that, and it changes the X and Y and scale and all these things appropriately. And
Hmm.
every single one of the examples that came back from ChatGPT and Bard were literally just the same as like just X, Y, and scale. Not bad, not a bad solution by any means, but the perspective is off. Though. If you're a spaceship going right in the middle of it, the
Hmm.
stars can fly around you, and it wasn't quite meeting it there. And no matter how much I prompted it, it just gave me various variations of the same thing, ultimately to the point where it just doesn't work at all. Like still
Hmm.
required me to write coding. So I think we have a ways to go. But where I am most impressed by with AI though is like Mid-Journey and Stable Diffusion and some of those things because I'm not a designer. Like I cannot design my way out of, any kind of situation.
Hmm.
And so I really enjoy seeing like that kind of capability exists for AI where I just type in verbally what I want to do. And even like Adobe has Firefly where they have some really cool things there. Have you played with any of those by any chance?
I haven't honestly. I'd be curious though. Like I know on your your website and your tutorials, you have pretty good graphics that feel very like tailored. Are you using like AI to generate those?
No, I actually write them all. I still do them by hand,
Yeah.
actually,
Okay.
like
They
the
look like it.
diagrams and
Yeah.
so on. Yeah, like,
Yeah.
that to me doesn't really. I don't consider it art though. It's just basically me like going to a whiteboard and just like drawing, adding some caption, drawing an arrow, screenshot or visual. And so
Sure.
to me, those are just like I guess it's part of PowerPoint art in my world.
Yeah. I mean, it's an important art, but okay. So you're talking a little bit more on the like illustration kind of like side of things.
Correct, correct. I mean, I did try actually using both of them, like both chat. I mean, not well, Stable Diffusion and Midjourney to kind of figure out like, can you create like if I describe something, can I draw the art? Can I do it properly? I think I'm just really picky in the style that I want. That I could never get the. The funniest thing is, curved arrows looking
Hmm.
not blurry and like all of that. I don't know why this is so difficulty in it. Like I think only until like maybe a few months ago was text actually legible and properly done. Like there's always a joke
Hmm.
is like characters have like odd number of hands. Like you can tell
Yep.
like six
Exactly. Yeah.
fingers or like something like that. That's like classic example of AI. But no one ever tried like put some text in there to see how bad that comes out, right?
Hmm.
And so I think there's still a little bit of ways to go there, but I do anticipate that happening eventually, though, because a lot of what I'm doing here is very repetitive. It's like
Hmm.
here's a focal image, here's some lines, here's some text, and then like probably like some icon that is through in from the Twitter emoji set, and that's pretty much it. So there's no level like the creativity doesn't go beyond a certain limit, which is perfect for AI systems to figure
Yeah.
out what to do.
Yeah. Exactly. And you can actually theoretically come up with like a fitness function here where you're like, hey, like this is accurate, right? Versus like illustration, which is like completely subjective, right? So obviously it's a totally different like universe for quality and ensuring it, right?
Yeah, yeah, and so yeah, I think there's probably like maybe 6 months to a year away from having more of that because I figure if we went from like six fingers to now having text that looks good to actually having people pretty much like creating videos that seem pretty decent for the amount of time it takes to create things without you actually touching an animation tool or a video tool. That's quite impressive.
The speed at which this stuff is moving is crazy. I feel like it's almost like a full time job. I think there was like a couple months where I was paying attention on a daily basis, and I kind of felt like I knew what was going on. I haven't been paying as close attention the past couple months, and like you're saying, text is working now. Didn't know that, so like things are just moving really fast.
Yeah, the funny thing is that I think it's been like almost a year now of like latest chat GPT and then like maybe a
Hmm.
little bit longer than a year for like the image generation tools. The unlike other things, right, that come out that are like really cool and mind blowing, you eventually hit a wall and then like everything just settles and you start seeing like, content built on top of previous content. You start seeing like, okay, I learned this, I can build upon this and I can sort of make sense of what's going on. And now I'm at the point where like, okay, I know everything that's going on in this area, with enough effort. With AI though, like I think it's almost like we releasing the water from a dam somewhere, and the water just keeps flowing. No one really knows how much more water is left on the other side, so you never get
Totally.
to a steady state. You never figure out like, okay, I learned all these things now, but then suddenly something brand new comes out that takes what you learned before into a whole new level of productivity. You're like, I don't understand this now. Like I need to relearn things like
Yeah.
LangChain. It was not really a thing like a year ago, but now that's the
Yep.
way you got to do it to train things or vector databases and things like that. Like just even conceptually keeping up to speed, even ignoring the technical details, even that is hard. And the funny thing is, like I spent a lot of time, my full time job in some ways, to kind of keep up to speed on this, and even I'm all completely
Really.
behind.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, when I was still working at Snowflake and just with like other like engineering friends in the field and stuff like that, one of my favorite things was always just to find the smartest person I could and just ask them to explain to me whatever was going on. And I had people drawing me out like the transformers or LLMs or like whatever pieces, like and like you can see them like thinking they understand it and then like working through it and they're like, oh crap, it's actually like a little more complicated than I thought it was. And like obviously they all get there and they're all geniuses, but yeah, it's I think just like yeah, I think you said it all right. I think just like the black box nature of it, I think is just interesting too, right? Like even the people that are building them don't know how they work fully, right? Is my understanding. Maybe people do, but like I started reading like the Wolfram like 6,000 million like page long thing, like walking through how LLMs work, and it's just like trying to build it up from like first principles or just like basic building blocks, and it's just like yeah, you just can't, and it's crazy.
Yeah, it's like the layers of abstraction needed to make sense of it are just massive. Like I never learned machine code or assembly, but I'm glad it exists because it allows me to do all these higher level things that I'm doing right now. But at some point, whether you kind of want to or not, you can kind of go, okay, how does my code go from like what I'm writing to
Hmm.
what's going to happen? Or how does my visuals go from like the pixels on screen to something I actually manipulate and make modification to vector, raster, and all of these things? I think with AI, there's just so many unknown areas. It's kind of like you're just trying to find a gripping somewhere. Okay, I'm gonna grip. I understand this basic part of it well enough to start as a point where like, okay, I don't know anything above me, I don't know anything below me or to the side of me, but I know enough of where I am right now to make this work. I think with AI, a lot of us in this boat were like, there is no area where you understand enough to even have a solid gripping to know like which direction do I go through next. And you're right, even people who are experts in this field, they have a very narrow slice of it they understand really well, and it has to get narrower and narrower because the field just keeps getting broader and
Yeah,
deeper very, very quickly.
yeah, you have like expertise and like this like teeny tiny thing that's like maybe out of date in 5 minutes. It's tough. Yeah, it's like yeah, mile wide, mile deep kind of thing, right?
Exactly. And so at some
Yeah,
point, we'll get to the area where the water hits the edge of the rivers, and it's like, okay, we know where the edges are now. Now let's
yeah,
take a step back, take a deep breath, and now go and then reverse engineer basically the output into what's going on. But right now,
hmm,
even the outputs are just randomly increasing in quality and speed and
totally.
performance. And yeah, it's going to be interesting seeing like all these supercomputers going to like smaller computers, and then your own devices now can do like AI and things. But it's a democratization of AI. I think that's like the new thing because we've had AI forever. Like your credit
Yeah,
cards being able to tell you, oh, someone is using this thing. Are you sure it's you? And you're like, that's it's actually me. But good call on that, and things like that, or airplane bookings and so on. It's always been there forever. Like, or I think for me, my favorite example, all the photo editing tools, or even just like photo galleries, where you upload your own photos. You
hmm,
can just type in words and be like beach, and then it just knows like like 10 years of photos
yeah,
it's
yeah,
archived, like, which of them are like wow, that's really cool. But now you and I have the power to build something that is exactly this, and then every startup every day seems to be adding a twist to it, which makes it pretty compelling.
yeah. There's so much going on there. I think the one of the sort of like side effects of this that I'm excited about is just the amount of people working on GPUs. And so, like GPUs are going to get like faster, more efficient, like whatever they're just going to be totally commoditized beyond where they are now, I assume. And you see so many people just squeezing every ounce of power out of GPU. So you see cool new graphic stuff like every day too. If you follow kind of like graphics world, um, even like the hot thing of the past week has been like Gaussian splatting. Have you seen this?
It's of the train, right, of the train engine in WebAssembly.
Yeah, that's the popular demo. Yeah, so basically
Yeah,
just like I think it's like a handful of photos, and then it just figures out that it basically makes a point cloud out of like
yeah.
ovals or like blobs, and then you can just real time move around. It's super cool. It's super cool, and I feel like maybe I'm overstating it a little bit, but my sense is that like this stuff is a little bit downstream of all the AI stuff because there's just so many eyes on GPUs right now.
No, completely agree because one of the big things that AI is going to help with greatly is in asset generation. When you look at like how complicated it is to generate 3D assets, like, like some of the people I know work on Unity games and like the editor
Hmm.
and so on. They love the editing environment, but they're like the hardest part is getting high quality models, and they pay companies that literally take a camera on the back of a truck and like drive hundreds of miles taking pictures and videos of like the scenery around them, like road signs and
Yeah,
things like that. Imagine a world where all of these are dynamically generated procedurally through just code, and then the technology exists to smooth it out, make it look really good. That train demo for me was just mind blowing in so many ways, because I felt like only a few months ago I was watching like the cityscape being designed really realistically, and I was like, oh, this is actually pretty cool. Like, I can see geometric shapes, and it look, the bridges and things look real. To now having a train where I'm like zooming in, I'm like, okay, I want to see where the imperfections are. You can see it if you focus really well, but it's on par with like the best hand generated, games, 3D visuals you might see elsewhere. And I
Yeah.
think the developer said that the actual human work to do that wasn't very large. This is the training and the generation part that took a little bit longer, which is like amazing.
Yeah. 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 It's mind blowing. I mean, I think the math on these things is so far beyond my like comprehension, but just the fact that like, they're, they can, I forget the right terminology, but it has real time reflections and stuff like that, right? From like a couple of photos, it can just figure out how things reflect and things like that. It's just like completely crazy. But anyway, this is like, people can't see what we're talking about. So this is maybe not the best thing, but it's super, super cool.
Yeah, I mean, I think for those watching on YouTube, I'll try to put like a video of it overlaid on top of both our faces,
Nice.
so this be like, as awkward as it can be. But
Perfect.
yeah, I
Perfect.
think we can definitely do that. But no, I am always impressed by that. So yeah, AI can kind of make a lot of these things that are hard easy. But if you don't know what you're doing, sometimes you might have to spend a little bit more time figuring out where the AI went wrong, so you can debug it and figure out what's happening there. So, all right. So you've been doing all this work, and then you decided to build your own company. Oh, tell me more about that.
Yeah. Let's see. So, I was on another brief break at the time after going to a startup that didn't end up panning out, and a coworker of mine that had worked with me at Dropbox before that startup had started working on a new project. And the basic thing, the way he kind of like explained it to me was like um, he wanted to figure out what he could do as an individual to make a dent in climate change. Like if I recycle more, if I stop flying, or if I buy an electric car or whatever, like which of these things will actually like matter the most, and like how do I actually like work through this kind of like thinking from kind of like a more consumer kind of level, right? Like where's the Google Docs for this, or where's the Dropbox paper for this? Um, and I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. Like I don't know, like I'm not an expert in this space at all. I think it's a totally compelling question, and it also sounds like a compelling design problem, right? And so we ended up working together. So his name's Brian Smith, and um, yeah, it's interesting because I think that was kind of like the inception, and then like startups, like we had many detours along the way. Like this thing for one period of time was a way to it morphed into like a way to diff like your financial model from like Excel and render it on the web and give you like a GitHub diff style thing. And then at some point it would turn into like a data visualization tool for like data journalists. And so then it was like a way to kind of like suck in like data from anywhere on the web and like kind of get like relatively clean data that you could like kind of work with. And then eventually kind of like morphed into this more just like traditional BI SQL editor thing. But I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. But like, yeah, I mean, it was kind of just like this curiosity around like, could you build a tool to like solve this problem for like our kind of personal need? It was not some sort of like, hey, we have this like massive business idea that's going to like change the world. It was just kind of like, this thing should exist. Let's make this thing.
Yeah, and I remember I don't remember the parts of the very early stages of your startup, but definitely when you had the data visualizations of like, here's some data, here's going to visualize it really nice way. That's when I really noticed it, because at that time I was at Salesforce, and
Mm-hmm.
Salesforce just bought Tableau. And so I was like, okay, what is this Tableau thing? Like, what is so interesting about it? Salesforce had to buy it. So I was like reading up on all these kind of activities. And then your tweets actually came up quite a bit. And the part I think that's also like interesting about what you're describing is your ability to simplify and share ideas visually in a Twitter in like a tweet like form. I think that's highly understated. It's actually very well done. Like I remember all the time, like some of the most effective things I always see is like, okay, that's a really nice idea, but it's visualized poorly or it is described absolutely awfully. But you seem to have a knack for being able to have that marketing side totally figured out.
Interesting. I I feel the exact opposite. I feel like I am aggressively bad at Twitter and tweeting, but interesting to hear. I would say like the one thing I would just say on this is like um, empathizing with no one caring about what you're doing is really important skill. If you're doing anything visual or like design, right? Like you just have to like you have to completely just whatever work you put into whatever output, like you have to just eat it. It doesn't matter how long it took. It doesn't matter how hard you tried. Like you just have to eat it, and you just have to like assume like the worst critics are out there, and just kind of like you can optimize for that or you can ignore that or whatever. But I think like if you kind of just like take that, it helps a little bit, right? It's like if you're a harsh critic of whatever you're putting out, it helps.
I think so, and this might be me generalizing poorly here, but I also think that because you and I guess like are used to creating content, and just putting it out there all the time. We grew up in a world where there was no Instagram, there was no Twitter, there was no like real time feedback where you could be like, oh my gosh, half the people don't like what I'm doing. There was not that feedback loop was so time consuming and long that it just became second nature to be like, this, we're gonna share this out. Like, what's gonna happen? Like, will anybody see it? Maybe, maybe not. Who cares, right? Whereas I
Yeah.
feel like the generation of designers and developers, there's people coming up today, there's in the back of their mind, they just have this fear that everything they're doing is being judged, will be tracked forever, and this portfolio they're building is always going to be available somewhere. And like gives them a hesitation where, we talked about earlier, just chip it out there, just get it out there, see what happens. Unless we formalize the word MVP. I think like that became a term, but I think you and I probably had the idea of MVP even before this formal thing where it's like, I'm building something, let me just try it out, put it out there, see what people say, and then iterate on it in the open. I feel like that has gone down quite a bit in terms of like the art, right, and the creations I see people sharing these days.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I mean, I think yeah, I think you can kind of like track this history, kind of like looking at like Instagram. I think it's probably like the best example where it's like, it started out as this like casual place to post photos that you're doing stuff with your friends, and like it was just like chill, no one cared. I'm having coffee, whatever. Twitter was like this when you started too, and then it turns into a bigger network and a bigger network, and it becomes kind of like almost like your permanent record to like put something on like your feed, and then they come up with stories or steal stories or whatever you want to call it, but like okay, here's our escape hatch where you can still do casual sharing, but if you post on main, yeah, it's like your permanent record, and this is going to go with you everywhere, and that's just permeated everything now, right? And I think I'm stating the same thing you're saying, but like it's interesting where it is scary, right, to like put something out there and be like, attach this to me for all time. The the good thing is, it's like I'm very mixed on this. I mean, I have a very love hate relationship with like every social network. I've deleted all my everythings many times, and sometimes I'm like I'm professional, sometimes I'm unprofessional. So like I'm very scattershot on this, but like I do think that there's sort of like there's a balm a little bit, which is like, okay, everyone's posting a lot of stuff, and so like your stuff is just kind of a drop in the bucket. So don't worry about it so much, and just kind of get out there and do your thing. But the other side is like, that's true in real time, but you also have the historical record where you can go like look at someone and you can like scroll back and be like, what was group up to 10 years ago? And it's a little weird, it's a little weird. So I empathize with the people who are skittish, but it also is sad because I do wish there was a more exploratory, like kind of like world out there where people weren't afraid and people were taking bigger risks than just being a little weirder. And we do seem to have like lost that a little bit.
Yeah, and I think the other angle also is that the way content is surfaced to you and I is very algorithmic, and there's a
Yeah.
pattern of what follows. As like, here's the kind of content that's going to be trending and make it, seen by other people, and here's the content that will not. So indirectly, your behavior is also influenced by, do I want people to see this? If I do, here's the things that I need to do differently. So the authenticity of like, here's what I think is I want to create, is then now
Hmm.
goes through multiple layers of, I need to adjust this, tweak that, add this, and make all these things. Because if I see one more video on like how Mr. Beast does his video thumbnails, I'm gonna like probably start
Yeah.
screaming. But I'm like,
Yeah.
I get it. He makes good thumbnails, but not everybody. But what about the authenticity of like people doing quirky things? And it happens every time, right? And some new networks gonna come out being like, we're for the indie developers and
Hmm.
designers. We don't care about our popularity. That becomes hugely popular, and then
Yep.
it either gets sold to a bigger network or it stays and it becomes very popular. Where again, you have this thing where like, how do you surface content without overwhelming people with like a billion things? Like deviant art is still around, and I see them like having the exact same challenge because I think during our time they were the place you went to. It's like a hip community where you just like throw
Yeah.
things out there and see what
Yep.
happens. They're still trying that right now, but when you have like tens of millions of people, it becomes very, very difficult to maintain it.
Yeah. Um, yeah. There's the maintenance, the algorithms. I think one thing I think about a little bit too is like just the periods at which like new forms develop is just so breakneck speed now too, right? Because like presumably you could draw a parallel to like okay, like essays as a random thing, right? In magazine essays or something like that, like that's a form that developed over time, and it has all the incentives around like what sells, what doesn't sell, what can you do ad placement next to, what's the right length, what's a good, what's a good opening paragraph, like all this stuff, right? And it probably took I don't know, hundreds of years to develop or something, or decades. And then now he's just like, okay, new social network, new pattern, new norm, new way to game the system, and then just another one, another one, another one, another one. It's exhausting, right? And so I think there's also just like a very like unnatural, non-human scale evolution of like the way that like we build community on the internet too. This sounds very doom and gloom. I'm glad this stuff exists. I get exposed to cool stuff all the time. I find all kinds of neat stuff, but it's a weird time. It's a weird time, and I just feel like it's accelerating, which is weird.
Yeah, it really is. Speaking of upcoming new things, are you interested in like AR and VR and some of the stuff that's going on there?
I am looking forward to getting a Vision Pro and just like putting it on and like walking into a wall. But I so far have had not. I haven't had a very um, successful or interesting kind of like relationship with the stuff that exists today. Like I have a couple of like the VR headsets and stuff, and just like the motion tracking stuff. I get very car sick or motion sick, and it's just like it
Yeah.
can do it for like five minutes, and then I'm like out of it. Um, I would say the technology in the Vision Pro seems amazing. I can't wait to actually try it in terms of just using your hands and like the eye tracking and all this kind of stuff. Um, and I think there's going to be a lot of cool new ways just for people to like experience visual spatial stuff. I don't really even know how to say it. It's just like a whole new terrain, and I think very interesting things will come out. My fear is that it's somewhat of an isolating technology, right? And so this kind of like slow trend of like what we're doing right now, right? We're on screens together. It's good. We're connecting. I'm glad, but you know, more people sitting on their couches, plugged in all day, is not a world I'm super excited about. So I'm very mixed on it, right? I think like
Uh,
yeah,
no, I completely agree with you on it. I think it's just that, I mean, I think COVID didn't help much in terms of like normalizing video calls and some of these activities. And
yeah,
I think the the motion sickness part is something I really, I completely relate to because every time I use any of those devices, after like what 5 minutes, I'm like sweating profusely. I didn't realize,
yeah,
but it's
yeah,
like when they I'm like, wow, I basically look like I just ran like a 5K or something in like 10
yeah,
minutes. And that's where I think the augmented reality part I think might help a little bit because the parts that are peripheral and like your things are like
yeah,
based on reality. So turning my head around very quickly, I can be like, okay, the room is still adjusting, at the right speed it wants, as opposed to like lagging even subtly. But yeah, until we try it out, though, I won't know because I tried the HoloLens. That had its, pros and cons, and I definitely felt a little bit of like, motion sickness from trying that as well.
yeah,
I never got to try the Google Glass, but to me that was the right form factor because it's just a glass. I can just like walk around with it because I think eventually it's going to get to the point where I'm looking forward to like kind of like a Neuralink like thing where it's like just open me up, stick a chip in there, power me back in, I'm good.
okay,
No one to charge something, no one to carry
yeah,
anything with me because I was always a skeptic of this, but I got LASIK about like a couple of months ago, or actually a year ago at this point, right?
okay,
Mind blowing experience. I'm like, wait a minute, my vision went from like something like, it was like, wasn't bad, but it was like still, blurry if I didn't have my contacts in. Now I have like 20/10 vision. I can actually see like even better than like without, with that, even with glasses. I'm like, that's amazing. This is the kind of biohacking that, you always read about. It's like the end of humanity. I'm like, sign me up for more things if there anything like that comes up. And so that kind of like completely changed my perspective on like where does hardware end, where do humans actually begin, which is probably like another whole terrifying world in its own way.
yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think you took like teeny tiny step on the path, and now you're like, oh, I'm going to go the whole way. Just wire me up because I think like the Neuralink thing is like skip your eyes, just like straight into the brain, like yeah. I think I'm on the other side of the fence on this one. I think I'm a little terrified of the Neuralink.
No, I hear you. I hear you. But so there's a leap you also made from you had a startup and I believe it was sold to Snowflake, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's huge in its own way. And then you at some point you shifted from being essentially a designer to being a manager of designers. So how did that transition work? What was the big learnings in terms of like how you had to adapt to a new world?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So let's see. The TLDR on it is the Snowflake bought Numeracy because we were doing innovative web work in like data visualization and querying and stuff like that. And at the time, they were not as kind of advanced. They're very much like a database company building tools. And so their UI was very effective for like a very like specific audience of people who super duper understood databases. But if you wanted to like expand that tent a little bit, it wasn't really the right tool. And also it was just not a modern web stack and all this kind of stuff, right? So they brought us in, and pretty shortly after, there was some open question when we joined about, is this going to be sort of like a supplementary kind of product that we offer, or are we going to try to kind of bake this in a little bit more? And it was decided that we were going to actually shift all of Snowflake's UI, basically like onto our stack, or we were going to bring our stack into Snowflake and kind of like keep the UI similar and kind of like rebuild the existing stuff inside of this, like Numeracy was the name of the startup, inside of this Numeracy UI. And then kind of like go from there. That's gonna be the new foundation, right? So anyway, with that, they were like, okay, well, who should be the person that's gonna kind of like lead that effort from like the design side? Well, maybe the designer from that thing, which is me. Yeah, my boss, who was the head of product, basically was like, do you want to try this like design management thing? And I was like, maybe. And we had a bunch of conversations around it. And ultimately I landed on like, hey, like this is a huge learning experience. Like these kind of opportunities don't just kind of like show up that often. This is certainly not the path I thought I was on, but yeah, let's give it a crack. And I got a lot of support from him over the years, but yeah, I spent a few years building up the early design team all the way to when I left. It was on the order of 30 plus folks on my team who were doing, all over the world, doing all kinds of interesting stuff, from user research to design operations to just like product design and like a bunch of other things. And yeah, super interesting. Maybe I'll pause there. I think you had other questions, but I feel myself going on and on.
No, that's actually, I always enjoy hearing more about it, because the shift from being an individual contributor to being a manager is a huge one, because there's really no guidebook, or just like back in the internet days, right? Early days of internet, there's really no guidebooks that are actually applicable, because it's so context sensitive. Every situation is very unique. Every environment you're operating in is very different. Snowflake is very different than Salesforce, than Google, than Microsoft, or any of these other companies. So like whatever best practices exist in the LinkedIn thought pieces are absolutely not going to be applicable to your case. So how did you manage a transition? You mentioned you had good
Yeah.
guidance from your manager at the time, but there were a lot of just things you just had to learn along the way. So what were some of those biggest learnings?
I mean, everything was a learning. It's super interesting. I mean, I think like probably like the core learning for me, honestly, is just that like people don't operate like you operate. Like whatever it took for you to get to where you are is not going to work for other people. In the same way you're saying like this, like this generic advice that you're going to read isn't going to apply to like the context you're operating in. It also doesn't work for your team, right? And you shouldn't hire a bunch of people that are just like you either, right? Like you theoretically could hire a bunch of clones, but I don't think that's smart. And so yeah, I just like like I think like the things that motivated me. This is like almost bad to say, but like I'm kind of like shame motivated. I'm kind of like, I just like, if something's bad and my name's next to it, I just like can't handle it. And so that motivates me to try harder and push and push and push. And it's not necessarily the healthiest thing, and it's not like the thing I would like encourage other people to like develop. But useful for me, whatever. And so like working with like new folks and just figuring out like new ways to like motivate people and new ways to talk about kind of like, what's good enough and when's done, and like all that kind of stuff. Those kinds of things were like not the things that I thought would be as challenging. I think I kind of like naively assumed there's kind of like just like a shared understanding of like anything, right? Like quality or rationale or whatever it is. And just learning that like, oh, everyone actually thinks about things completely differently. And that's the benefit. That's the benefit of building a design team, is that like you get exposed to different ideas and you kind of, materialize that stuff in different ways. But yeah, people are different than you. That was a surprisingly challenging learning. Like everyone's not you.
Did you also get to do some design work as well, or were you full-time just managing people at that time?
I started hybrid. So I think this is very common in like new managers, particularly in design. Like design is a field, right? It's still like relatively like nascent field. And like, I've worked at a handful of like serious engineering companies, and like engineering people kind of know how to run like an engineering team at like a serious scale and stuff, but design teams are all a little different, all a little weird. So, and also like leadership doesn't always know what to do with designers, right? So yeah, I was doing design when I started managing, which is like when I look back on it, it's like, okay, just join this company from a startup. You need to figure out how to like learn what this new company does, and then you also need to chart a path forward that like makes sense for the company. You also need to adapt to this thing, to this other like alien thing, and then also you need to like figure out how to design some new features at the same time and figure out how to manage people at the same time. Was doing a little bit of that for a little while. Painful, painful. Um, interestingly, probably useful, honestly, to design with like the early team to kind of build credibility, and like
Yeah.
rapport. And that stuff does kind of radiate out over time. Like your credibility does kind of like, matter like in that way, but painful, painful.
There's so many studies. The ones I do tend to agree with are that whatever discipline you're becoming a manager in, you should still be qualified to be an individual contributor if it came right down to it. It means if you're a design
I
manager,
agree.
you still need to
Yeah.
be able to both appreciate good design, identify it, critique it properly, and be able to do things. Just like if you're an engineering manager, you should still be able to understand high level coding concepts and maybe even write code as well. Same with product management and so on. And do you feel that is also relevant in your field as well?
I think it is. I think it's interesting. Like at a certain point, it has to break down, right? Like you can always start from the other end, which is like there always has to be a CEO, and there always has to be, people under the CEO, and eventually like theoretically functional leads, or whatever you can do the GM model. But I think it helps a lot. I think at some point, I'm biased on this, but I think you do want someone leading the function who does actually have that credibility too. Um, but you see models where there's totally successful leaders of like design organizations who didn't come from like a product design background. They come from a writing background or operational background or whatever, and it works. It's just it's just a different. Depends on what you're optimizing for. I guess is like the short way of saying it, right? Like if you're
Yeah.
optimizing for like world changing, game changing design, you probably want someone with like the design background. If you're optimizing for scaling, maybe you want operational background. There's different ways of looking at it.
Exactly. I think you hit it right on because there are different terminology we give to various people. Like, we give it like the 0 to 1 people. We give it the operator is
Yeah.
a name for like some of the
Yep.
styles of individuals. And it's also, yeah, and you mentioned, like you mentioned, it depends on the stage of the product you're currently in. If you're trying to build a product from the ground up, very different set of teams you need to be able to, work in ambiguity, even more so than normal, and be
Yep.
able to take decisions very quickly, which means they probably have a sense of what is good and bad across any discipline they're currently operating in. And then you get to the point where it's like, okay, now we're more of a mature product line. How do we make sure that we don't break things too much? And there's a whole different set of things to think about. It's one thing to go from like 0 miles per hour to 30 miles per hour in your vehicle,
Mm-hmm.
then go from 30 to 45. Very different set of skills. And the people who might have built the 0 to 30 mile per hour solution probably bored out of their mind. They have to basically just incrementally move the needle to like make
Yeah.
something move better. And it also has to do with the company's culture as well. In top-down cultures, there might be like slightly a little bit more impetus on the person who's making the calls having enough domain expertise to not say something or do something or guide the team in a direction that is completely, off the rails. Whereas in a bottoms-up culture, it could be there's a little bit more wiggle room where decisions are often made by the people who are actually closer to the actual work and less so on the leadership. Just has to, I guess, in some ways, just be an umbrella to protect them.
Yeah. And that stuff's like there's a whole separate probably podcast on that topic for like a company like a Snowflake doing design at that kind of company, right? Where it's like um, the designers typically don't come with deep domain knowledge on like database internals or ETL or like whatever, right? And figuring out how to like build that knowledge throughout the organization, and like how do you balance like the sort of like technically correct, maybe that comes from the side, or like top down, like how do you stitch together like 8 like random complicated things, or like bottoms up like genius idea that emerged out of like the woodwork. Like all that kind of stuff is like very interesting too. And like you know, I think it's a slightly harder playing field than your consumer apps, which is like you can just kind of empathize with like the problems, and you just like, yeah, like you probably want to be as bottoms up as possible, versus like an enterprise kind of thing where it's like it's all kind of got to make sense together somehow, and it's actually like a lot of smart people working on this in like different places, and it's all got to cohere. That stuff's tricky.
Yeah, very much so. And Also like getting back to the manager role in some ways is that when an individual contributor, your number one goal is like, okay, I have this task, how to make the best thing possible and like,
Hmm.
and ship it and make sure, that's all the right things. And depending how senior you are, your criteria and for success might be, broader than your immediate team. When you're a manager, I often found that in many situations, you see the end result, you see exactly how this should be done, but it's not in your best interest to tell someone, here's what's going to happen if you go down this path. And so there's this balance you have to strike between like the right thing for the product is to make sure this error does not happen, but the right thing for the growth of this individual is to think through the process, make the mistake, learn from it, so they become more effective as an individual contributor. And one day when they become a manager, they can also take these skills forward. And those tensions are often like no one ever talks about it or writes about that because those are like that's the art of management, which I find
Yeah.
always very confusing.
I think it's the right thing. I mean, I think it is the art, right? If there was a science there, I would love to read the paper, and make this easy, right? Because yeah, I mean, that's right, right? You want people to learn their own lessons, and there's that tension between, that slows the business down short term, and maybe creates, challenges with like coworkers and all that kind of stuff. But you do have to kind of like let it happen, but judiciously, right? So I don't know, if you find the energy to write that tutorial, I think that would be really helpful for everyone.
Oh, I'm still learning, every day. Like I think I mentioned before, like I optimize for only working at large companies because at some point you realize the skills you learn apply or either apply to small companies or large companies.
Yeah.
And if you want to be a domain expert in that field, you have to choose one and stay in that particular lane. And so for me, I'm like, you know what? I have this knack for understanding organizational politics and drama and chaos. And so I'm
Hmm.
just gonna go in large companies because the things I learn here only work in a large organization. If I do this in a smaller area, it's gonna be like either I'm completely like giving guidance that is way wrong, or I need to learn a whole lot more at this point, which might just be way too much to kind of do this. And I always look for what are patterns that I can use to generalize so much of this. And again, it's so contextual. There is no real pattern in terms of this, right? Because, for example, you mentioned that you're reporting to a head of product.
Yeah.
There's many situations where that's worked out really well, where a person of a different discipline, you're working with that person, their manager, and it's been very successful. I've also seen many cases where it was absolutely did not work out well because the
Totally.
the context awareness and the appreciation for the little details that only someone who's done that at an IC level or at a manager level a long time ago would actually understand, like how does something go from where you had it to where it is now. And so again, there's no pattern I can come up with. So if I ever wrote anything on it, it'll basically be a condition of if else statements and say like if this
Yeah.
happens, if, and the
Yeah.
next paragraph will completely contradict that because
Yeah.
it's all based on people.
It's all people. It's all, yeah, dynamics, time pressure, goal. Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot. But yeah, I think the functional reporting thing is actually interesting. Maybe like a quick note on that. Um, I think the situation that Snowflake I got lucky with was, the head of product I reported to the entire time, Christian Kleinerman. He's awesome. It was amazing. He was just basically was like, you know, you're the domain expert. Run. I'm going to give you sort of like company priorities, and like I'm going to like kind of keep you on the rails in terms of like the big picture, but didn't get in the weeds or in the way with the design stuff. And I think that's a good model, sort of like, sort of like the keeping you pointing in the right direction, but letting you do your thing. And sort of in that sort of like, learning from your managers and kind of like working with your team. I had a head of research reporting to me, and it was like kind of like the same thing in reverse. And I had a user research, and was lucky to kind of try to get to emulate some of that kind of stuff too, which is like cool. Like, you're the expert, like go do your thing. I'll help point you in the right direction, but I'm not going to get in the way and like tell you the study's wrong, or your findings are wrong or whatever. So um, I guess if there's a point I'm trying to make here, it's that, working for a good manager. I think if you're becoming a manager and you want to become a manager, you need to work for a good manager. I think if you're trying to become a good manager and you just work for some random person, you're going to have a much harder time.
Completely agree with you. And you mentioned the word luck about two or three times here, and I think that's actually a critical part of it because
Oh yeah.
when you're working for a small company, the chances of you being able to better have an idea of the team culture and how, individuals work and so on, greater. I'm not going to say give it 100% chance. I'll give 50, which is probably the best odds you can give in any situation of the sort. But in a large organization, there's so little insight you have into how things go because the larger the organization, the more microcultures exist. You could be in an organization that's historically known for a certain type of operation, but you could be in a team that is very different. The leadership team of that team has a different way of doing things, and you could actually be like, wow, this is actually really cool, and I expect that, in terms of this. And that's always things I always like think about whenever I do a lot of time mentoring other PMs and other people who are like about to join the career, and I always explain like having a good manager is the most important thing of all. Like
Yeah.
everything else can be arranged, can be moved around and things like that. But the first couple of managers you have, especially early in your career, until you get a good solid idea of like, this is right, this is wrong, here's how I'm going to do this, and so on, and be able to defend it, having that level of, great people to guide you is absolutely critical. And it's one of the things where I'd say as an industry overall, we don't do as good of a job on it because everyone has their best foot forward during the interview process, and you have such little insight both on both ends. The
Yeah.
company hiring you has really insight into like who exactly you are in terms of how qualified you are. They see your portfolio, they see your ability to do various tasks, but it isn't until you actually join you get a good feel for that person is, and vice versa as well. Because oftentimes, if you're working in a cross-functional role, it's not just your manager; it's the quality of the people that your manager is working with
Yeah.
that play a big role as well. So it's one thing to have like a fantastic manager and then very low agency peers that you didn't have to like negotiate with and so on. And these are all things that you never know until you actually join. So the luck part is often critical. And if I ever do write a book, that'll be on how do you maximize luck? How do you increase the chances of
Yeah.
being in a
Yeah.
situation where you can be more successful? And I think those go back to, do you enjoy what you're doing? Are you really good at what you're doing as well? Because you just put the hours in and you're really good at that. Those are the kind of tangible skills that aren't going to guarantee that you won't be in a tough spot, but at least it'll give you enough ammunition to at least survive the first couple of rounds of a zombie wave.
Yeah. Yeah. And like, are you getting better too? Right. I think it's another important one too. Is right. Or do you want to get better? Um, you know, growth is really important. But yeah, there was something you said that I wanted to. Oh, I think one of the interesting dynamics too for me with these kinds of companies, like you mentioned that you have decided that you want to stick around at like large corporations, right? I
Yes.
assume it took you a while to get to that realization, right? You didn't start there.
That is correct. That is correct. And for me, it was interesting because I still do Crypto.com even now.
Yeah.
And so for me, that gives me the balance of like when I have a day, I'm just like, okay, all I did today was just push an email back and forth between 10
Sure.
people, made zero progress. Let me quickly just do something on the side that gives me the satisfaction of this day wasn't a complete wash. So that kind of gave me the balance where I can go fast, break things, and do the stuff that I do on the side, but also kind of do the things at a larger company. I did not, you're right. I did not know this is exactly what I wanted to do. But once I got into it and once I made enough mistakes and learned how to not make the same mistakes again, I realized the skills that I have right now pretty much qualifies me to be more successful in a larger organization than
Hmm.
it does in a smaller one.
Yeah, and I think I guess the two things. Well, first, like the comment on having Krupa on the side, .com, sorry, Krupa.com. Yeah, super important, right? Like same for me. Like I was figuring out this manager stuff and like, I'm kind of stressed out. I'm definitely making like weird like art stuff on the side and like that was very helpful. It's like, there's like there's no there's no way to measure the success of this other than something I invent, and like that's an important sort of like release valve when you're working in like an enterprise when there's 1,000 ways to measure everything you're doing. So like I agree with that, but the reason I asked you about the question about did it take you time to figure out that you wanted to stick around in large organizations, is because I do have this feeling that the younger generations now are all kind of like in a sprint mentality of like pick the perfect company, and just climb the ladder as fast as you can. And I think like that was certainly not my experience. Like when I got into this stuff, and the world was different then. Design was a much more nascent field. But I just got exposed to a bunch of different stuff, and I think that was extremely useful. And so, like we were kind of talking about the importance of having a good manager. I agree. I also think it's important to like get exposed to less successful or like less effective like working styles and things like that. Like I've learned all kinds of like anti lessons throughout my career, and like those were as valuable as like the positive lessons, right? And so I do think it's an interesting thing now where like at least in the design field, because it's maturing, it does feel like there's a little bit more of that sort of like I don't know the right word, just institutionalization or something, right? Where it's like, just like get in, pick the right thing, climb. And I think people should be a little more it just takes a little while to figure out like what the right fit for you is, right?
No, completely agree with you. And I absolutely agree with you, your comment on it's also good to be in unideal situations where you might have a crappy manager and things like that. Like I will say that some of the best learnings and things I've actually had things to do was under a series of managers who I would say were not very good. And that gave me more confidence actually in some ways going like, okay, this is a weird situation, but let me try to understand what is it that they bring to the table that makes the organization still value them. Because I always
Hmm.
found that poor effective managers are enabled in some form or fashion. Like,
Of
yes, there's a
course, yeah,
case where they are, poor and then like 6 months, a year later, they're ultimately, managed out or up, however the company decides to deal with poor performers here. But in many situations, though, I feel that they've been that way in that position for a long time and they
yep,
aren't feeling any repercussions of it. And it kind of makes you question like, wait, is it me? Am I the problem here? Am I the one who is just not able to relate to what this person is doing? Or are they doing other things that I cannot see? Because as a manager, you
yeah,
probably found out that your reports have very limited insight into what your day-to-day job often is, and the
yep,
amount of heroics you probably do on the side to make sure their day jobs are, going the way they do, often goes under and unknown and underappreciated. And so I often try to figure out like, okay, what are they doing that I don't see that might give them an edge that actually makes them very valuable to the organization as well. And those things have been very valuable, in terms of internalizing like, okay, this person isn't doing these things here, but what are they doing that makes them successful, and what can I learn from that? Like if the managers, if you and your manager aren't getting along, I feel like your time in that team or situation is really limited anyway. Like you don't want to be there for a long
sure,
time. So the moment you learn what it is that makes them valuable to your organization, you take that with you and you say like, okay, how can I apply this in a hopefully a better way than my manager did, but still take some of the positives and carry that over into like large organizations. This goes back to like why large organizations are ones that I specialize in, because those kind of things are often not really done as much in smaller companies where the culture clash is too evident. Either you're out very quickly before you get to learn it, or your manager's out very quickly before you get to learn from
yeah,
them. And so large organizations give you the kind of the buffer where just bad decisions and bad individuals can thrive for a little bit longer.
yeah, 100%. I agree with that. I also think it's important to at some point decide if you um, feel like you align with like whatever the incentives are for the organization that you've kind of like figured out by like looking up or looking out or whatever, right? So yeah, all that stuff's really really good. I think just that like curiosity, that mindset of just kind of like trying to figure out how it all fits together, benefits everyone, right? So this is again like my plug to I don't know who. Just yeah, this like straight line approach I think is never the right thing. I think it's just like yeah, try to figure it out, try different things, like all that kind of stuff. So yeah, plus one.
Yeah, like the whole idea of like the game of chess analogy often like get makes it more clear the longer I'm in like a large organization, my scope keeps increasing, and I'm like, yeah, there might be cases where here's the obvious path, but if I take this path, how will all these other people in my periphery react to it? Even in your own
Hmm.
organization, how will they react to it, and how do I navigate in a way that, depending on your style, you could be definitely one of those people who's like, what's in it for me? How can I make sure I win or my organization wins at the expense of everyone else? But if you want to think about how do I make sure that everybody wins, in a certain fashion, how do you game this out? And so for me, like all the video games I used to play, I haven't played a video game in like last 3, 4 years now. In many ways, it's because I've taken all those role playing games I used to play, on that screen, and now I apply to the real world. I'm just sitting there going like, okay, I have a 20% chance of this conversation going in this
Uh-huh.
way. What is this? What is the secondary option where like we both walk out of this feeling like we did something, something good? Or do I just roll the dice here, just to say, okay, I'm just going to do this, and and see what happens? So many times, and I find that's exactly like what your day job is sometimes.
Yeah, that's a good analogy or a good tool set, I guess. It's very very analytical. I think I probably would have benefited from doing some of that. So that's another tutorial you could write.
Well, I mean, just play Skyrim, Fallout, any of those kind of games where you're pretty much thrown in the deep end and you just have to slowly grind your way into like having the skills needed to survive. And then a lot of it is going to be talking to people and choosing options in conversations that either lead to what you wanted to happen or the opposite. But nice thing about video games, you can also save the game and you can reload it again if something goes wrong.
Yeah,
Which in
harder in
in,
real
in,
life.
the, in
Yeah,
job, it's a little bit more difficult to do that.
yeah, that's funny. No, that's a good
Right,
that's
Josh?
a good analogy. I like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I know we've been chatting for quite some time. So last thing I'm going to ask you is that I noticed that you're sharing a lot of, like little like pattern-based animations and visuals recently.
Mhm.
What's the story behind that?
Oh man, um, this is my like current like white whale. So I think like superficially, it's just some like interesting maybe cool looking stuff that you can see on your web browser or on social media or whatever. And it's something that I've done off and on forever. I actually remember when I was thinking about like talking to you, um, it must have been in Flash, I think. Um, I made some generative thing that just created a bunch of like is very I actually remember exactly how it looks. It's very ugly, but like I was proud of it at the time. But it's just like a bunch of like triangles that were like mirrored. So like basically random triangles, basically just like ugly butterflies or something. I don't know. And but like just like that sort of like ability to create something on a screen that is like superhuman speed, right? Like you can just get something like out and it can have a time component and all this stuff, whatever. Like I think that's like a very interesting problem space. So fast forward to I'm now doing this for probably 25 years or something, which is insane. And I don't think I've progressed 25 years worth of like skill or anything like that, but I have progressed 25 years of hand wringing. So I spend a lot of time picking apart like what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, and is it interesting, and am I contributing anything to anywhere? And so I've taken the fun out of it, and I still like doing it, but I'm trying to figure out what the next steps are. So yeah, for those who those aren't aware, you can go to my website joshuajenkins.com, and like there's just a bunch of um, web browser based animations, column animations. I call them works on screen. And yeah, it would be good if I had something smart to say about this because it is something I'm taking kind of seriously, but it's also uh, I'm in the early stages of figuring it out.
No, I think it looks fantastic. And for again, those who are watching it as opposed to listening to it on their trafficy car ride, places, I'm actually going to have it on the screen where they can see the animations you've been
Oh no,
posting
okay,
and things like that.
okay,
So yeah, that's going to be great. But Josh, thanks again for chatting. This has been fantastic, and we should absolutely do this again soon.
yeah. Thanks for having me on, and it was good to reconnect.